Hello and welcome back to Kerbal Space Program. Now, I've never done one of the Reddit weekly Kerbal Space Program challenges before, but last week seemed like one that would be a good one to cut my teeth on. Now, unfortunately, I saw it the day before it went back offline, so I came to it a little late, but I figured it was worth trying anyway, so here's my attempt. So the nature of the challenge is basically that our manufacturers, for whatever reason, an April Fool's joke or some other reason, have failed to deliver parts to us. We only have one part from any one manufacturer. Basically, if we use a part from, say, Rockomax, we can't use any other parts from Rockomax. Same thing goes for Kerbidyne and the rest. So the challenge was to get to Minimus, but the hard mode was to get all the way to the moon and back with our Kerbal surviving. That was a challenge I decided to take on. Remember, we can only use one part from any one manufacturer. Of course, we have to get back alive. But that one part from each one's pretty hard, because after all, how can we land on the moon with only one strut? All the struts are made by one manufacturer. So here's the parts I put together. As you can see, each one is only from one manufacturer. We added that electronics item so we wouldn't run out of battery power. Added a little bit of a thruster for some extra control on the descent to the moon. This fuel tank was for our landing stage, so we'd have enough fuel to land and get back from the moon. I thought this might give us a little extra fuel from Probodobodyne. And use this aerospike dart for our landing and return stage. Since we couldn't use 3 landing legs, we had to use landing things from 3 different companies. A wheel, a landing leg, and this landing gear from Lightyear. Took me a minute to get it lined up exactly how I wanted it, of course. Went ahead and put a radial mount parachute from the Finding Lying on the Side of the Road company. Only one decoupler. All decouplers are made by one company. Kerbidyne large tank for our ascent stage. And finally, a mainsail engine from Rockomax. We went ahead and named it one of each is the name of our ship. And we decided to have Val fly us into orbit. So I went ahead and did this all at 4 times speed. So we wouldn't have make it too boring. The ship was mostly okay to fly, although the way that those landing gear were set up, because the ship was a little unbalanced. Luckily, I had it oriented in the right direction that it tended to want to arc over a little bit, so it wasn't too hard to control on the way up. But on some test flights, if you pushed it over a little too far, it really wanted to go out of control. So I had to take it easy and go straight up a little farther than I'd like to. I wasted a little bit more fuel and didn't do as good of a gravity turn as I wanted to. But either way, I got into orbit, went ahead and circularized, got ourselves all set up, as you can see coming up right here. Either way, once we were in orbit, we went ahead and started getting ready for our maneuver node to get to the moon. That was just very straightforward as usual. And then we went ahead and began our burn for the moon. Now, I'll do this at regular speed so you can see what happened. I had a little bit of fuel left in my main engine, although that ran out pretty quickly. When I went ahead and detached the stages, this happened. The ship almost went veering off out of control. And I discovered that if I amped my engines all the way up to full throttle, the ship wanted to veer off to one side. So I went ahead and I ended up having to use my RCS jets throughout the flight in order to keep myself on target. But here it wasn't too much of a hassle. I was able to, I only had to burn for a little bit, so I was able to go ahead and get myself recentered by lowering my throttle. And then I made a little bit of a mistake here. I tried to go ahead and ease my orbit down just a little bit closer with a few puffs of my engines, and I went a little too far. So I had to waste a little bit more fuel correcting that, pointing back retrograde and burning again. But with a little bit of adjustment, we were well on our way to the moon. Put us back into 4 times time acceleration here to get our way through the trip to the moon. And we'll rejoin once we've arrived. Now, as we came into the moon, I went ahead and prepared myself for our burn to bring us captured into orbit. But I went ahead and kept the apoaps pretty far out so I could choose my landing spot pretty easily. And all that was left then was to go ahead and try to land on the moon on these 3 unstable legs and hope we had enough fuel to make it down and make it back. So I went ahead and we'll do the landing sequence at 1x speed so you can see what happened. I was worried about going into that crater with its slope, so instead of the gradual slow burn down, I went ahead and opened the engines up all the way and came down almost vertically. I brought out my gear, as you can see. And once we'd arrested almost all of our horizontal motion, that's when I went ahead and cut the engines. Right there. After this, it was a pretty straightforward, gradual drop down towards the surface. What I found on test flights, preparing for this, on my initial attempts, I found that the 3 landing gear I had chosen, as much as I tried to have them lined up perfectly symmetrically and horizontally even with each other, no matter what I did, if I was landing on even the slightest slope, the entire rocket would tip over. And even with those RCS thrusters on the nose, it was almost impossible to get myself back into an attitude where I could take off from the moon without just completely exploding. So I finally found a spot that was nice and flat on this attempt. And prayed as we came down that not only would I land straight, but that I do so slow enough that I wouldn't bounce. The attempt before this, I came down finally on a flat area and just hit so hard that I bounced up and again fell on my side, meaning I wasn't going to be able... I was able to land safely on the moon without anything exploding, but I wasn't able to leave the moon without completely destroying my ship. Here we come. The surface coming up. After my several initial failures, I might have been a little too cautious on this approach, but I was really paranoid about hitting too hard. Even though normally the landing legs can take quite a bit of a beating, the 3 that I chose to use, as you can see once I've landed, you'll see what happens. We touch down, and it immediately leans over to one side. Luckily, this time it stayed upright. And here we are on the moon. Time for Val to step outside and leave proof of our visit. Of course, Val couldn't help but take a moment to enjoy the low gravity. And then she went ahead and planted a flag for us. Reminding future travelers that next time we need to make sure we order the correct parts before we try to go on any ambitious space missions. Okay, and with Val getting back into the cockpit, we were ready to try to make our return trip to Kerbin and hopefully survive. As you may have noticed, I didn't put any heat shielding on this craft, and that's because, unfortunately, the manufacturers of heat shielding also make other objects that I needed. So I went ahead and did the return trip at 4 times time acceleration because, unfortunately, we weren't able to do it in one pass, as you'll see. So we took off and headed towards Kerbin, towards an orbit that would return us back into Kerbin's sphere of influence. I went ahead and tried to lower my closest approach as much as I could. And then we went around the planet once. And once I reached Apoapс, we went ahead and burned again to bring my closest approach down well within Kerbin's atmosphere. And then it was up to the atmosphere to do most of the braking for us. But I figured once I hit the point of closest approach, I'd go ahead and fire my engines to bring down my Apoapsis even more, hoping that we'd be able to do this all in one pass. Unfortunately, my fuel didn't last that long. I didn't have a whole lot left. And even as much as the atmosphere braked us, as much as we slowed down, it wasn't enough to do it in one pass. And we very quickly began heading back outwards, although we did lose a couple of the landing gears that we'd added from the heat. I had those deployed, hoping that we'd get a little bit more wind resistance out of them, slow us down a little bit more. But we began climbing again, and we went all the way back around. But finally, once we hit the atmosphere again, we were well captured. We were on our way back down. Now, I made one mistake. I left time acceleration on, as you can see on the upper left-hand corner, not realizing that I had done that. So I'm going to do this at normal speed. You're going to get to see the reentry as it happened at 1 times time acceleration. But you can see at the top, I had it at 4 times. The ship started veering off center, and I started trying to correct that without realizing that I wasn't at 1 times time acceleration. Everything was moving 4 times faster than I was expecting, and I quickly spiraled out of control. I thought I lost the ship at this point, as it very quickly entered into a almost missile trajectory, a nose-first attitude. But luck was with us, and we passed through the worst of the heating. But we were still in a bit of an uncontrolled spin at this point. But finally we slowed down enough that I felt it would be safe to go ahead and deploy the parachute. Which put us into an even worse spin. At least for a few moments. Until we were finally low enough that the chute could actually fully deploy. And it was about that moment that I realized I was still at 4 times time acceleration, and that was probably part of the reason I was having so much trouble controlling the craft. But, oh well, you live and you learn. Fortunately, this time, we lived, so we could learn. And after that, it was just a matter of waiting until we hit the ground again. Mission accomplished. To the moon and back with only 1 part from any one manufacturer. Val was happy to be home, and she jumped for joy. We'll join her next time in another episode of Kerbal Space Program. But until then, I leave you with the motto of brave Kerbals everywhere: per ardua ad astra, through adversity to the stars.